Hi everyone, Rob here. In this video I'll be looking at how you can use Epic's free face tracking app and UE4 as an incredible tool for viewing and recording facial capture, how to quickly get that data into a program such as Blender from Unreal, as well as how to view the raw output data direct from the phone to open up some additional workflows directly into Blender. I'll be providing example files that you can download with the assets, which are, as ever, royalty-free and copyright-free. Now, I should point out that I'm still working away on my own solution for face tracking that doesn't require iPhones, along with a cheap head cam that I'm putting together. But I've noticed that lots of other people are struggling to use and install the pre-release builds I'm putting out there, which is a shame, but it's hardly surprising because it is, after all, pre-release and I haven't got that much time on my hands right now. But my plan is to start regularly releasing more assets and tutorials going ahead, so I thought I'd make a quick video going over how you can use what I release with some other tools, such as this, so that if you find that my pre-release stuff is a literal non-starter, that you can still get up and going with other assets, with other tools, and still dive in. I'm hoping to start releasing tutorials and assets on an increasingly regular basis, so if you do find this tutorial and content helpful or interesting at all, do consider liking and subscribing because it really helps me out a lot. Great, now let's dive in. Now, unlike the tool I'm putting together, which just goes off optical data, the caveat with this app, of course, is that it requires you to have an iPhone or iPad with a depth camera. So if you do have one, search for and download LiveLink Face. I'm also assuming for the sake of this tutorial that you have and can download Unreal Engine 4.25 or above, which is itself a pretty straightforward install process. It's free and pretty simple to install. And as I said, you can just go ahead and download the example project I'm releasing with this video in the description, so it should be very easy to get up and going. Now I'm going to cover the full process of using LiveLink with Unreal. If you're already familiar with this and you just want to see how you could use the app more directly with Blender, then go ahead and skip to those chapters towards the end of the video. So go ahead and open up the example project in Unreal. Once it's open, you'll see the mesh that we'll be animating. Any assets I'll be releasing after this should also have the same hooks in place too, if you want to use those instead of this one down the line. Now, for the mesh, there are a few things to go over if you wanted to make one yourself. If we open it up, we can see that there are morph targets for the various shapes, and the best thing is to make sure that your mesh has shapes with matching names to this, because it makes setting up the anim blueprint considerably more simple. If you have a mesh where you can't change the names, for whatever reason, you have to make a blueprint that will do the remapping on the fly. I've included an example of this in the files, but I haven't hooked it up to the anim blueprint because of course the names do match here. But I'll cover what to do with that in just a second when we get to the anim blueprint. So to get started, go to the window menu and select LiveLink. This will bring up a window. If you don't see this, make sure that the plugin is enabled within your project. And whilst we're on the subject of plugins, it's also important to stress that you do need to activate the ARKit plugins, of which there are two. So search for ARKit and enable those. LiveLink with this workflow will just not work without those activated. And if you're activating them for the first time, then you need to close the project. Since they're enabled here already, we don't need to. And now with the LiveLink plugin enabled, we can make an anim blueprint with the LiveLink node. As you can see in this example, it's pretty simple. You just have a node here for LiveLink, which hooks into the final output. Now it's here that you would select that remapping blueprint asset if you were needing to, but again, we're not doing that here because we don't need to. And the more trickier of the bits is handling the rotation of the bones, which means having nodes here that hook explicitly into the curves for the rotation and then are multiplied and then added to the bones transform. One thing that might make you trip up with this, however, is that the curves are probably not on your mesh already. I mean the curves that detail the yaw, roll and pitch of the head. So you want to go to the skeletal mesh, go to the skeleton tab, and then go to the bottom right here with where the curves are listed, right click and then add those three curves. In the example mesh we have here in the file, they won't be there, but you can see me adding them here in this video. And with that anim blueprint set up, we are pretty much good to go in Unreal. So to get going with the app, we open the app on the phone, and you should already actually be able to see it finding and tracking your face already on the phone. I should also say, of course, just quickly make sure that the computer you're sending to and the phone are on the same network, or obviously it won't work. Now hit the settings icon in the shape of a gear in the top left and select the top option with Live Link. You'll have the option to add target. Press that and you can enter the IP address of the computer and a port. Now leave the port as the default and enter the IP address, the one of the computer which is running Unreal. Now if you don't know what this is, there are a few ways to do this. One way is to go to the Windows Start menu, run command prompt by typing CMD and enter, and then typing into that IP config, all as one word, lowercase. And with that you'll see a list of all the different network devices that you have on your computer, and you're looking for the IPv4 number. And alternatively, you can always just find it via the control panel, like so. With that IP address added in, press add, and then that will go back to settings. And whilst you're here, you may as well go ahead and check stream head rotation, unless you're looking to fix the phone to your head with a helmet, of course. Leave settings by swiping down and then return to the screen displaying your face. Make sure the box with live written in the top is green, and because this indicates that you're streaming over Live Link, or at least attempting to. With that done on your computer, you should now see your phone appear in the Live Link window as a source. If you don't, then make sure that your phone and computer really are on the same network and connected. There may be issues with your firewall. Sometimes Unreal does seem to need a quick restart, maybe, I've found. And again, make sure the plugins are all enabled and all that jazz. Sadly, this is one of those things where it kind of depends on your setup, and I can't really explain and anticipate every possible thing which could go wrong with it. But fingers crossed it should work. It did for me first time, and I have a very basic setup, so I don't think it should be too difficult. And with that, we are pretty much good to go. So if you press play to start the project in Unreal, you should now see the face animating based on what you're doing in the app. So we now have Unreal getting the data from the phone. How do we actually record this? Well, you can always record directly on the phone, and we'll go over that workflow later in the video. But for now, let's record in the Unreal editor itself. Now make sure that you stop the project if you still have it running from the previous step, and go to Window, then Cinematics, and select Take Recorder. This brings up the Take Recorder, which basically looks for changes in an actor in the scene and then records those changes to a sequence, and then you can play it back later. Now select the mesh that we're going to be animating and then click Source in the Take Recorder and then select that mesh. Once you do, you can then click on it and see all the properties that Take Recorder can record. We're going to deactivate some of these because they will interact with the recording in a way we don't want, but we're also going to leave some on because they're also important in getting what we need. One thing to bear in mind is that for the example project, I'm very deliberately having the skeletal mesh at 1:1 scale, rotation and location with the world origin. This is to make sure that there's no issues with scaling that can arise from importing skeletal meshes from Blender into Unreal, which is itself a very long, boring and very complicated subject that I can't really start to explain because I don't really understand it. But for now, with this setup, it works nicely enough. So with that done, let's hit play again, check that we have the app communicating nicely with the editor, and then hit the red record button in the Take Recorder. This will have a little countdown, and then we can record what we want. So we'll do the classic poses that everyone always does in these demonstrations, and then hit stop when we are finished with the take. We'll also then hit stop in the project and then go to our content browser, find the cinematics folder, and then within that go to takes, and then within that you'll see a folder stamped with the date that was recorded, which then has a sequence, and then a folder within that which has the animation which we'll be extracting. If you click on the sequence, you'll see that this is where all the values were recorded, where Unreal has logged not just the animation, but whatever values you had in the Take Recorder selected, such as it could be visibility or whether it was spawned or transform or relative 3D, all these things. So you can look over that if you want. I think by default Unreal has the sequence spawn a new instance of the mesh if you start playing it back, so you'll see it overlapping in a kind of trippy way, but you can hide the original and then just view back whatever you've recorded. For this workflow, however, we can of course just go into the animations folder and directly get the animation asset of the skeletal mesh, and we can see indeed that this has recorded exactly what we want. So now we have our animation asset in Unreal. How do we get it into Blender? Well, with the animation in the animation viewer, we can right click and export to FBX. Make sure you are in this viewer when you do this, because I've found that when you try to do this from the content browser, it just doesn't seem to actually do the export process. So make sure you're in the viewer. Select a destination for where you want the file to be saved to, and in the final window make sure that you have Export Morph Targets and Export Preview Mesh selected. You can pretty much unselect most of the other things here because we don't really need those. Now, what we'll have then is an FBX at that destination we selected, and it's very tempting to just import this directly into Blender, but you'll find there's a problem which may be fixed in future, but certainly as of September 2020 with Unreal 4.25 and Blender 2.9, you get this problem where you get a warning and the mesh has no shape keys and the animation just isn't imported. This isn't a problem with Blender, I think, but it's rather something about the way FBX was exported from Unreal, but don't quote me on that. Thankfully, of course, we do have a solution to this problem. You want to download the FBX Converter, which is a free program from Autodesk, which is the company behind FBX, I believe. So if you search for FBX Converter, make sure it's the official Autodesk site, and then install the appropriate build for your system. Open up the converter and then drag the Unreal FBX file into the left box, and you'll see that you can actually drag multiple files into here, so you don't have to spend too much time if you have a lot of animations in bulk. Leave all the settings as is and then hit convert in the bottom right, and it will just very quickly make some small changes to the file. And by default there'll be a folder called FBX 2013 next to that original file. And if all went well, we can just import as we would do with any other FBX, and voila, we have our animation in Blender. Now there are some important things to fix up, I'd argue, which I'll go over in the next section, but this is actually pretty good. We have our animation, we have the skeletal animation, we have the shape key animation, so we could kind of stop there, but there are a few very quick things we can do to tidy up and just make our lives a lot easier with this animation. So what exactly needs to be fixed? Well, the animation on the skeleton and the shape keys are treated as separate actions in the import process. And this is just something to do with the way that Blender treats skeletal animation and shape key animation as opposed to Unreal where they're all bundled together. Now this isn't inherently a problem of course, but it can be annoying if you're working with lots of different takes, which is a very tempting workflow because of course Blender has a non-linear animator, for which this is most assuredly not a tutorial, but you can see it's a very nice way of working with different actions, which is Blender's name for blocks of animation, where we can drag them around, we can blend them together, similar to how we would do in a video editor. But if the bone animation and the shape key animations are separate, then we lose a lot of that flexibility. Now it's possible that the non-linear animator has some sort of inbuilt solution to this problem, but the trick that I've found is to get the animation for the bones represented as shape key data, so that we can then have drivers take that data and then control the bones. With the first method, there's not much to cover, thankfully. If you have the scripts that come with the example files, then you'll see that we can just take the FBX that was imported, make sure we have that mesh selected, and then go to the script and just double check that our bones are named as we want them to be so that they correspond with the bones in the project. And then just hit play and then run the script. Now it may look superficially intimidating maybe if you don't use scripts that often, but think of it as just a case of making sure the names are correct, making sure that you have the mesh, that is to say the facial mesh, not the skeleton, but the mesh selected, and then hit the play button and it should take care of all the rest. And now if it's all worked correctly, then we can go to the non-linear animator, collapse the animation, and then just as we wanted to, we can drag it around and we get that animation updating as desired. This is also how I handle importing multiple animations out of Unreal into Blender, because of course Blender does import a new mesh and a new armature every single time. The workflow there is to again collapse everything down into a single action with the script, and then within the NLA. Then within the NLA you can select the track of your target mesh, which is labeled NLA track by default on the left, and then go to the Add menu within the NLA and select Add Action Strip, whereupon you'll have listed all the actions within your project. The action strip you select will then be added to the current point on the timeline. You may also need to select Add Track if you want to add a strip directly on top of another, and so in that way you can take all the separate actions from different objects within a scene and have them associated with a single object. Now, the second way to get around this workflow hiccup with FBX is to import directly from the app rather than through Unreal. You may recall that we could record within Unreal, but we could also record it in the app itself. Now when you record within the app, it actually stores and writes all the performance data as a CSV, which is essentially a spreadsheet containing all the coefficients of the poses as plain text. To actually get hold of this CSV, hit the icon in the bottom left of the app to bring up recordings, assuming you made a recording of course. Once you select a recording, hit the share button in the top right, and then what I'd suggest you do is save it to files, in which we can then actually look at all the things that have been exported. So we can see the movie file and we can see the CSV. Now what this means is that we can send just the CSV if we want, because that's actually a very small file, or we can also send along the video file for reference, but the video file is very large and it takes more time to send along than just the CSV. I personally use Google Drive. I assume you can share files out of iOS to Dropbox and so on, or you could connect the iPhone to your Mac. I don't know about PC, but certainly Google Drive works very nicely for me in this instance. Once you have the CSV on your machine by whatever method you choose, then there's again just a very simple script I've placed along with the example files that will take the location of that file as an input, and then just as we did in the previous workflow, check the bones are named as we want, and then do basically the exact same process where it's just going through that data and then writing the shape keys and then adding drivers where necessary. And again, we then have the ability to, just as we did before, collapse it within the NLA, where we can once again move it around, blend it with other animations, and so forth. Now these scripts have been tested with the assets that I use and distribute, so it's possible that due to the way that Blender and, for example, Unreal differ with rotation, that you may have problems with the scripts, and you may need to tweak which key corresponds to which axis of rotation. There's sadly no way that I can account for every single possible setup that someone might have, but fingers crossed this should work for you with other assets, and it certainly will work going ahead with everything that I put out. So there we go. I think it's a fantastic app to get up and going with face animation, to dive in and see what's going on. Obviously with the proviso that you have an iPhone, it's definitely the easiest and cheapest way to start familiarizing yourself with all the workflows. The only downside is of course that you don't get translation of the head, that is where it is. You only get the rotation on the neck, and more crucially you don't get eye tracking for some reason, which I think iOS does indeed provide, but who knows. Now those particular problems don't impact another very popular program called FaceCap, which my assets are also compatible with, which I'll consider putting in a tutorial in future. But of course there are already other great resources out there if you want to see what's going on. But considering that my channel is a lot about keeping things open and accessible as possible, with Epic providing this super robust app for free, I thought this is a great place for many to start, whilst my own program is in its kind of pre-release sloppy hell, you know. So thanks for watching. I think that about wraps it up. Again, as I said earlier, if you do find this interesting or useful at all, do consider liking and subscribing, because it really helps motivate me to keep making these things. And I'll hopefully see you in a week's time looking at what we can do with head cams. Anyway, have a nice day.